Ukraine and Russia are once again claiming to have destroyed each other's drones. Kyiv says it downed 15 Russian drones on Wednesday night, while Moscow says it shot down 6 Ukrainian ones over Russia. The attacks come after Russia targeted the port of Izmail on Wednesday. The strikes hit grain facilities in the city across the Danube River from Romania, which is a member of NATO. Falling debris from destroyed Russian drones also damaged a building in Kyiv. Earlier this week, Russia said it destroyed Ukrainian drones targeting Moscow. It also claimed to have taken out a naval drone attacking a Russian warship in the Black Sea. We're joined now by Sam Bendet. He's a fellow at the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. Welcome back to DW. Good to see you. So how has modern drone technology made this war different from previous ones?
Well, a lot of these drones actually provide very important intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, but they also provide a long-range strike capability for either side that is at a fraction of a cost of using more expensive missiles. The fact that a lot of these drones are flying in large numbers is also indicative of the desire by both sides, militaries as well as the defense industries, to manufacture as many of these drones as possible. Once again, these drones are actually much cheaper and much easier to use than using expensive long-range missiles.
Ukraine has talked about deploying both air and seaborne drones against Russia. What do we know at this point about their capacity to reach Russian targets very distant to the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, we've witnessed Ukrainian maritime drones attacking Russian Black Fleet in Sevastopol. That's a distance of several hundred kilometers. There have been multiple strikes by Ukrainian drones against Russian territory proper. They've been able to hit military bases, energy infrastructure, and of course, Moscow, the capital city. So Ukraine has demonstrated that it could use its drones for long-range strikes, and that the Russian air defenses or electronic warfare defenses or any other significant countermeasures, while able to shoot down and interdict some of these drones, are unable to down all of them. And so Ukraine has a capacity to strike deep inside Russia's territory.
Moscow has claimed that these drone attacks would not be possible without Western help. Now, from what you've seen so far, have Ukraine's allies been involved in these drone strikes in Russia beyond providing intelligence?
Well, it's not clear. A lot of the drones that Ukraine is building are actually homegrown. So this is domestic capability. A lot of the components for Ukrainian drones also come from the international market. For example, Ukraine also has access to some Chinese-made components and microelectronics that it can use in manufacturing these drones. It also has a domestic high-tech industry, which is also assisting Ukrainian military in building these drones. So that claim is unfounded with respect to the actual technology.
When we're talking about drones, and correct me if I'm wrong here, we generally talk about combat drones, but Ukraine has also made extensive use of homemade off-the-shelf drones. What has their role been in the war so far?
When we talk about these homemade off-the-shelf drones, we're talking about FPV drones. That's the racing drone that has been repurposed into a one-way kamikaze strike weapon. And it is a very potent and a very powerful tactical weapon. Basically, it's a short-range drone that can fly very fast. It can deliver a rocket-propelled grenade or a very weighty munition, basically at a distance of anywhere between 3 to 10 kilometers. And so thousands of these drones are used by Ukraine against Russian armored vehicles, tanks, against Russian trenches and other positions. They've also been used by the Russian military and their allies as well against the Ukrainian forces. This drone is very easy to make, well, relatively easy. It is relatively cheap too. One drone can cost just several $100s. So basically a drone that can cost several $100s can damage or destroy a tank or an armored vehicle that can cost millions.
When it comes to surveillance and intelligence gathering, we're hearing that the sheer volume of drones, like the ones that you just described, on both sides, makes the element of surprise impossible. How do you expect Ukraine and Russia to adapt to this disadvantage for them?
Well, both militaries are now trying to disperse their forces. They're trying to avoid a large concentration of forces and vehicles in the field. A lot of the fighting is done at the very tactical level, at the squad, at the platoon, and the company level. Basically, just a few to a few dozen soldiers moving either during the day or during the night. And of course, both sides have these intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. These are commercial drones like Chinese-made DJI. They have these tactical drones like the FPV drones I just discussed to strike the adversary. But again, this basically forced the adversaries to disperse the forces, to hide better, and to move in small groups.
That was Sam Bendet. He's a fellow at the Center for a New American Society. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Kerry Chavez is a political scientist from Texas Tech University and research fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point. She focuses on technologies of international conflict and security. Now, how do you think has now modern drone technology made this war different from previous ones?
That's a great question. And I think there's been a lot of focus on these military grade or these advanced, what we call exquisite drones. But the real story, and speaking of the effect on the battlefield or the conflict at large, has actually been commercial drones, small drones. So we have to consider that Ukraine especially, and recently Russia, that has emulated Ukraine, has quite a vertical stack of drones. So they do have an exquisite arsenal, some of them indigenously produced, and they use them for these strategic type of strikes. So sometimes on ammunition depots, on logistical sites of high value, high military value to disrupt the enemy, and also on deep into enemy territory to rattle the civilians' conscience. But at the same time, they're using small tactical drones on the battlefield much more densely because they're more affordable, they're more user-friendly. And so we have this diverse arsenal on both sides. And interestingly, a day into the conflict, a year and a half ago, the Russian military, the Ministry of Defense issued a social media call for dronations or donations of hobbyist drones to put on the front lines. And even enfolded civilians in some of those early attachés to fly them. Those have made the largest difference. These exquisite drones are making a difference at a high strategic level, but because they're so expensive and so advanced, they're used with more caution. They're used at the grand strategy level. These tactical drones are being used prolifically and with quite a bit of polish on the battlefield.
Now, Ukraine has talked about deploying both air and seaborne drones against Russia. What do we know about their capacity to reach Russian targets very distant to the main battlefield in Ukraine?
These exquisite drones have quite a long range. They have an extensive ability to loiter and to sustain in the air. And so I think it's rather workaday for the advanced drones to extend well beyond Ukrainian territory into Russia, into its heartland. The same goes for Russia. They also have advanced drones. Both sides also have advanced loitering munitions, including those for Ukraine, donated by advanced nations in the West. And of course, many know that recently Russia has turned to Iran to obtain these types of platforms, these advanced loitering munitions. Those are those that implode on a target rather than dropping a munition. So we know that they have the capacity to reach one another from their own territory. The smaller drones are more constrained in their range and in their payload. But that's why they're being used for these burst missions on the front lines.
Now, you've mentioned that some of these drones may actually be manufactured in Ukraine itself, but Moscow claims such drone attacks would not be possible without Western help. What do you say to that?
I think that's false. Prior to the war starting, Ukraine had an extensive arsenal of drones, many of them indigenously produced, including these advanced models. They are relying on some Western help to replenish their arsenals, and that goes for drones, but also artillery and ammunition and other types of weaponry, because a total war against a powerful enemy is exhausting in materiel. So I don't think it's impossible that Ukraine can. They certainly can engineer and produce these. So can Russia. But it's more a matter of exigence during these quick tides of war that requires support from the West to replenish the stockpiles.
Dr. Kerry Chavez there from Texas Tech University. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
Let's get into more detail now on the use of drone warfare in the Ukraine conflict with Steve Wright. He's a researcher and developer of drone avionics. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, Ukraine has talked about deploying an army of drones, both by air and by sea. Do we know about their capacity to target, Russian-held territory or even inside Russia itself?
Yes, it's an interesting one, this, because both sides have been using drones in the battlefield, and they're clearly giving incremental advantages to the soldiers on the ground. And the Ukrainians themselves seem to be generally winning that race. Drones are not the big game changer yet. The standard weapons introduced by NATO are really the big deciding factors at the moment. But, and there's always a but, the way it seems to be playing out is, and this has certainly been true for the years I've been involved in drone development, is the use of drones in 21st century warfare so far. It seems to be following a very similar pathway, a very similar trajectory that manned aircraft were following the first half of the 20th century. During the First World War, for example, aircraft certainly made an impact on the battlefield, and sure enough, aircraft were raiding cities and everything like that. But they didn't make a huge impact on the outcome of the war. And here's the but, the big but is 20 years later, the Second World War, that it was fundamentally the same technology. The technology had evolved, albeit the same technology, but by then it was making a huge impact on the entire conflict, and very much making an impact on how that conflict ended. So I'm kind of nervously looking forward to the future, as it were. And that might even be within the context of this war, if it goes on long enough.
I want to drill down a little bit deeper into both sides' capacities in particular when you look at that analysis, because Moscow has made the allegation that drone attacks by Ukraine would not be possible without Western help. How much is Ukraine relying on its Western partners in its efforts to expand its drone program, and how much of the efforts are homegrown?
Well, and again, this is an amazing example of how the fundamental difference in the technology that we have here is also changing the way that the technology is acquired and deployed. So in other words, that's a really useful question, because it emphasizes the fundamental difference in the tech compared to what we've been using before. And so the tech's freely available on the internet, frankly. In fact, I'll give you an example. That is an autopilot, and I'd be highly surprised if it was anything but this of the vehicles that are arriving in Moscow. But the drones that were hitting Moscow have actually been partly financed through an online crowdfunding campaign. So fundamentally, anybody can back this. And so it's a very, very freely available technology. It's another example of this sort of dispersed, internet-enabled technology. And the Ukrainians have shown themselves to be phenomenally resourceful at deploying that. So in other words, they don't need direct funding. They've got the capability. And there's also this new way of bottom-up funding of the war as well, which is where that's going to go in the future. I have no idea.
How about on the Russian side? Because we know they've gotten quite a lot of help on the drone side from the Iranians, for example. How heavily do you see the Russians relying on their drone arsenal to keep the pressure on Ukraine?
Not much, frankly, because that's the Russians have been squeezed in several directions. Their ability to adapt seems to be vastly less than the Ukrainians, but that's more a statement about the resourcefulness of the Ukrainians. The other side of the equation is that the actual components and the electronics and the technology that goes into them is fundamentally Western technology. And in fact, one of the big scrambles that's going on at the moment is an attempt to prevent this Western components falling into the hands of the Russians. And there's a huge operation going on in the background. So the Russians have been squeezed out in that direction as well. So although, yes, they've got a capability, and the Russians have shown themselves to be pretty resourceful with drones in the past, I think they're going to find it a lot harder with dealing with Ukraine, though, simply because Ukraine is just showing itself to be so agile in the market.
That's really interesting stuff. Drone technology expert Steve Wright, thank you so much for joining us to share that expertise.
Thank you.